Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 64 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. Gavin, this is an unusual episode for us.
This is an unusual episode, so we're not going to do any of the usual pleasantries sort of at the beginning of this episode because I think this episode's was really important. We've been sort of building up to it for around the last month or so. But so we talked about it at length. I should have our episodes up in front of me, but I don't. But anyway, in late January, we sort of talked at length for, I think we even skipped today in history in that episode because there was something really tragic that happened at, it's called the Mill Creek Dinosaur Tracksite in Utah. If you've listened to any of the last 4 or 5 episodes, you've probably heard us talk about it. But we've been trying to get somebody who, was on the ground there, or at least, maybe somebody just that lived in the area, or somebody who knows more about it than we do anyway.
As it turns out, we found someone. When I say we, I of course mean you.
Right. So we've been trying to get somebody to talk to on the podcast, and turns out we had the best person to talk to about it, arguably. So we're going to be talking to Mr. Jeremy Roberts, who is sort of the person who first sort of raised concern. I guess I'll say the second person. I don't want to rob his son of the credit that he deserves.
as you will
hear. Yeah. So we've already done the interview. Unfortunately, Mike couldn't be there. It was just a sort of timing issue. So it's just me talking to Mr. Roberts. But it was a really, really great interview. Before we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about the site itself. Because, he talked about a couple things that without a little bit more context about like the site itself might not make perfect sense. And Mike, can help me clarify because he's listened to the interview already. So the track site is on BLM land. So as the Bureau of Land Management it is a section of the federal government under the Department of Interior. Most people are probably familiar with like the National Park Service. It is not that, and not close to that, not nearly as like well regulated and maintained as the National Park Service. The BLM holds the vast majority of federal land and is very understaffed given how much land they actually have to manage, which comes up, partially for how this kind of incident happened. So it is the trackside itself is around 15 or so miles from Moab, Utah, a very famous, very popular tourist place because it's near 2 very, very beautiful national parks, which would be Arches and Canyonlands National Park, as well as just a generally incredibly beautiful area of the country and the world. And so this track site has a bunch of interpretive stuff on it. It is a mostly dinosaur. There are some other things there as well, but dinosaur footprint track site. So that's what I mean by track site. There are dinosaur tracks preserved in the rocks there. And this is right up there with one of the most significant fossil trackways in the world. The track site itself is sort of early Cretaceous, so around 112 to 116 or so million years old. Some of the information about the site itself was a little outdated, so Mr. Roberts gives a year number that was not the one on like their own pamphlet. But given how well connected he is and how much he knows about the site, I would frankly trust him over the site's own documentation. So
yeah, like you weren't kidding when you said you found like the guy to talk to for this.
Yeah, absolutely, and he will tell his own story about that once we get into the actual interview. But so the track site is incredibly significant because it is huge. There are more than 200 individual tracks, most of which are still covered. They purposefully did not uncover them because tracks are very fragile. Mostly just because, unlike bone that has been fossilized that already has a mineral structure, this is sort of just an indent in the ground. So just walking on it even though like you might think, hey, this is just, rock on the ground, walking on it, or even just nature can be incredibly destructive to these. So a lot of them, they were able to like get like some kind of 3D scanner out there and scan them without uncovering them to help preserve them for longer. So, being early Cretaceous, this was obviously there were lots of dinosaurs around there, including everything from your long neck sauropod dinosaurs to, um, things like I think Mr. Roberts had mentioned an iguanodon, which is similar to what you're thinking of with like a duckbill dinosaur almost. Not quite the same, but closely related. All the way to things like your, raptors or dromaeosaurs, even like things like birds. By the early Cretaceous, birds were, well underway to becoming what we know birds as today. There are bird trace fossils, but what's really interesting to me is there were lots of crocodilian trace fossils. You can see places where a crocodilian just was laying down, and there's apparently a spot where you can see where one like slid into the water because it was sort of on like a lake or a river. So you can see where this crocodilian slid into the water. That's how great these tracks are and how well preserved they are. Um, and so, like I said, in late January, there was proposed to have been some work done on them because there was a boardwalk for people to walk on, so they didn't walk on the tracks. And the boardwalk had all sorts of, educational materials. You could read about the tracks and, learn more about the tracks in a, productive way without somebody being there all the time. It's like I said, the BLM is very short staffed as it is, so they can't really afford like the National Park Service to have, and that's not to say the National Park Service is all that well funded either. But anyway, there's nobody there monitoring it. It's just sort of a good faith thing. So you walk along this boardwalk, lots of cool information for you to read and look at, lots of really cool art from different paleo artists that you could see about the site. And apparently this boardwalk needed some work. And usually whenever work is done on federal land, there needs to be an environmental impact survey done. And apparently that was done very incorrectly in a way that Mr. Roberts will explain a little bit more about during the interview. But I think that's pretty much all I want to say. I don't want to get too much more into what we talk about in the interview. You'll have to listen to that yourself. But this was a really, really awesome interview. I couldn't have asked for it to have gone any better, realistically.
I mean, I don't quite know if this qualifies as breaking news, because I know we've talked about this stuff being reported on other places, but I feel like there are some nuggets in here that are kind of unique to unique to our guest. And breaking news might be overstating it a tad, but there's some information here I'm not sure you're going to get anywhere else, at least not for a little while.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will do a follow-up on this piece eventually.
As soon as we need to.
Right. The Inspector General of the Department of the Interior is looking into this incident because realistically some federal laws were broken, or at the very least like coming right up to that line of being broken. And usually when they do these kind of investigations, they release a report at the end. So when that eventually comes out, we will probably dedicate an episode to it, just because this is something that I care a lot about. This is the field that I work in, not just paleontology, but monitoring construction on federal lands. That's what I do. And so this is something that I care a lot about, and something that I think is just really important with like holding the government accountable for things that they do wrong, while figuring out ways that they can do things better in the future.
And with that, I think we're going to get right to the interview. So here is that interview, and then we should be back at the end for a just brief wrap up together. But here it is.
And we are back with our guest, Mr. Jeremy Roberts. And so I'm really excited about this little kind of interview. So why don't you go ahead and sort of introduce yourself, your background, and sort of your relationship with I guess paleontology sort of in general, and especially the paleontology of Utah. Before the events of about a month ago, almost exactly, at the Mill Canyon site.
Yeah, so I've been involved in conservation, but my conservation involvement has been mostly like shoreline, coral reef, seagrass, that kind of stuff. And I have a son, my oldest son has been somewhat of a fanatic of paleontology for a long time. And so when he was 10, a couple of years ago, he actually convinced the state legislature in Utah to designate the Utah raptor as the state dinosaur for the state of Utah. And then his encore to that is that he convinced the state legislature to go protect about 5,000 acres and create a new state park called the Utah Raptor State Park that'll set to open up next year in Moab. And it protects a site called the Dalton Wells Dig Site,
Mm-hmm.
where really a lot of neat fossils have been found. And so I've been involved in paleontology mostly because of my son.
Okay.
And so that's kind of how this kind of came about.
Awesome. And just for anybody who doesn't know, which I think most of our audience is fairly casual, but so Utah Raptor is a really, really cool dinosaur that is more or less what you're thinking of when you think of a raptor sort of dinosaur. It's about the same size as the ones that you kind of know from Jurassic Park, except obviously these days we know that they had feathers. But it is also just a really interesting sort of story around the Utah raptor in general. And Jim Kirkland, who's now the state paleontologist in Utah, who's actually kind of involved in this story.
He is.
So, yeah, so why don't you sort of go ahead and walk us through sort of the timeline of all the things that sort of happened around the site? Because I know mostly from what I was just following on Twitter, it was a little hard to sort of follow just because I wasn't sure who was involved on site, who was just sort of reporting other things that they had heard online. And it wasn't until I think that a Gizmodo article came out that I actually sort of understood like the actual series of events that happened. So why don't you sort of walk us through it as you sort of understand it?
Yeah, so I was actually in Mexico. I wasn't even in the country, but kind of in anticipation for the state park opening up. I was keyed in and watching anything at all dealing with paleontology in that area because it's kind of an exciting thing. And I came across, it had just been posted, and it was the environmental impact assessment that the BLM had done for replacing the boardwalk at Mill Canyon, which is this track site.
Mm-hmm.
And the track site in and of itself is kind of a fascinating thing. It was right at the kind of the banks of an ancient lake, and you can see more, a bigger variety of species than really that's kind of any track site in the history of these track sites.
Yeah.
You can actually see where ancient crocodilians were sitting on the banks and they slid into the water. You can actually see, and it's interesting, even the layman can see this.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually see where the tail of an ancient crocodilian swished. And there's some of the very first bird tracks that are there. It's a really famous, interesting site. And the reason why it got preserved as long as it has, which is, more or less 120 million years ago, is because the algae that was in the water mixed with the soil and created, for all intents and purposes, a form of limestone. And so this has been preserved. Well, the paleontologist, this entire dinosaur track site is about 30 acres. It's very large.
Yeah.
But paleontologists left most of it covered. They interpreted a very small amount and placed a boardwalk there so that you can actually go and stand and look down on the tracks. It makes it so that you're very close to the tracks. You can't damage them. But it was this really the boardwalk was actually put in there by paleontologists and volunteers, and it was designed to protect this very fragile, track site. The tracks themselves, this limestone, think sandstone. It's not, it's not load bearing. It's not heavy, it's not granite, it's not hard, it's a very soft rock.
Exactly.
Well, well, anyway, I sent this to my son who's now 14, and I had him read it. And I was out visiting Mayan ruins. I wasn't, really going to read this in depth. And he calls me back about 20 minutes later and he says, Dad, you got to raise the alarm. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, they're going to put steel and concrete on top of this track site. And he said, Dad, you can't do that. That weight will destroy the entire site. There's shell underneath.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do it. It can't have load bearing stuff on it. And he said, then on top of that, they're going to have to bring in the cement trucks. And do you know
Right.
how much those things weigh? They can't drive on those tracks. And then he's talking about the pumps and how those pumps, they
Mm-hmm.
splash. Well, what do you do if they splash on it? And then one of the other things that the BLM does is they acid etch the concrete so that you don't slip and fall when it gets wet. And he said, Dad,
Right.
it's alkaline. You can't put acid on top of the alkaline stuff. Everything
Mm-hmm.
about this is just terrible. You gotta like not let this happen. Well, this is my 14-year-old son, and God bless him, he's a brilliant kid.
Mm-hmm.
But before I go raise the alarm, I'm going to trust but verify, right?
Right. Yeah, of course.
So I called Jim Kirkland and Andrew Milner and a couple other paleontologists. And Andrew Milner is the paleontologist over the Johnson Farm track site down in St. George, Utah, which is another fascinating track site. And they've got some really interesting fish and stuff that are there. But anyway, they both said, oh, yeah, this is just terrible. So I made 2 phone calls after that. The first one was to Governor Spencer Cox from Utah.
Mm-hmm.
And Spencer Cox is excellent on these issues. You could not ask for a better governor on these issues. And then the next phone call I made was to Senator Mike Lee, who's our U.S. Senator.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike is actually really big on conservation. He doesn't trust the federal government to do the conservation, but he's actually really, really good on conservation.
Mm-hmm.
And so he helped raise a stink. Well, the problem was this is on a Friday, and we're
Mm-hmm.
kind of raising the stink and trying to get more information. And we're actually right now we have no idea that work's already been done on the site, no idea whatsoever.
Right.
And so I flew home and grabbed Jim Kirkland, and we drove down and met other paleontologists at the track site. And between that time frame, we found out that the BLM had actually taken a backhoe out and had ripped out this entire boardwalk that was there. Well, the problem is because they never involved a paleontologist in the planning and in the execution at any stage of this plan, they didn't know about all the tracks that were still covered up, and they cover them up for kind of myriad reasons. One of which
Mm-hmm.
is if water gets in them and it shrinks and it expands for ice in winter, that's bad for them. Then on top of it, wind comes through and it blows sand, it kind of, sandblasts them. So it
Mm-hmm.
protects them, just leave them covered. And then also for vandalism or anything else.
Right.
Now, we're really lucky that in this site, we don't have that problem because people are very respectful of, these treasures. Well, anyway, we get down there and there are tracks all over everywhere. I mean, it's really bad. I mean,
And by this you mean the backhoe tracks, right? Not to confuse.
Yeah. And
Okay.
so excuse me. Yeah. So the backhoe has driven all over this stuff, and they don't realize it, but they've impacted over 30% of the site. And there was an iguanodon track that I saw.
Mm-hmm.
It's about 30 inches, about a meter long, completely destroyed, just like destroyed. And then they stacked the boardwalk on top of other tracks. And so we're looking around at all these sauropod tracks that are completely driven over. I mean, a big, heavy backhoe is driven over the top of these things
Mm-hmm.
and destroyed them. And so we're all pretty crestfallen. And we reach out and we finally get a hold of the BLM. And the BLM is completely denying that they damaged any of these tracks. They said that they had not done anything wrong. And if you read their press releases, they echo that.
Right.
They say, that in the protected site, they kept using that word. Well, here's the
Mm-hmm.
problem. Under federal law, every fossil is protected. So I don't know why they were trying to wordsmith that to say it's the protected site. And I'm sure their solicitor wrote it, but their
Mm-hmm.
statement was intentionally deceiving. It was really disappointing. So I had reached out to the BLM and I said, look, guys, you can't do this. You've damaged these tracks. And they denied it. They said, no, there's no tracks damaged at all. And I said, well, I don't understand. Like, it didn't register to me why they were so defensive about this and why they were completely denying any damage had been done, especially when they knew that we had paleontologists on site.
Right. Yeah. So I guess at this point, had anybody from the BLM, because there's a field office in Moab, had anybody from the office been out at that point?
Well, so here's the thing is they claimed yes. So the person who was actually driving the backhoe was a BLM employee. We know that now.
Oh, interesting. Because
Yeah.
I'm currently working on, as most of our listeners probably know, I'm recording this out of a hotel because I'm out doing some field work, and we're doing some construction work on federal lands, BLM lands as well. And I think there's been one BLM person on site for the entire time, and I think he was only there for a couple of days. And I've been out here since September. So that's really uncommon that it was, a BLM employee doing the work themselves.
So this is where I enter conspiracy theorist. Okay. Now, and this is the thing. So let me kind of tell you really quick.
Sure.
I I don't like to assume bad things about people.
Right.
Okay. But I can tell you a couple of things that nobody knows about. One of which is when the paleontologist from Wyoming came down, and he's phenomenal, by the way. When he came down, he actually has all the 3D imaging
Mm-hmm.
of that track site. So they've got really hyper accurate 3D imaging. So
Right.
there was no question of what was done. Somebody had walked on, and by the way, they had chained it shut. So like no visitors had been able to get to the track site.
Okay.
Somebody had walked over all of the tracks that we've got photographs of from the backhoe, trying to make it look like only people have been walking there and that the tracks from the backhoe weren't there. And there are quite a few witnesses to this event. And here's what I think happened. This is my guess. And by the way, the investigator general for the Department of the Interior, they're actually investigating this. And I'm not calling for people's heads. I don't want people fired. I mean, people have children and families. They need to afford groceries. But we need to get to the bottom of this so it doesn't happen again. Well, I'm pretty sure what happened is that when the political pressure came out that said, hey, look, you've got to stop this project. I'm pretty sure the decision was made by somebody at the BLM to just go out and rip out the boardwalk right then and there. And the reason why I say that is because one of how rare it is to have the BLM operate the backhoe, right? That's part of it. And the second thing is this. Nobody's really aware of this, but they had already paid for and had built the boardwalk, the replacement boardwalk.
Okay.
And so the money had been spent. And so what I think they were going to do is say, oh, hey, sorry, we've already ripped out the old boardwalk. And I think the reason why is because they'd already spent the money and they didn't want to have the black eye of saying, oh, we spent this money and now we can't use this boardwalk we did.
Mm-hmm.
And the boardwalk was done by this young artist, but it sits on dinosaur. It looks like it's standing on dinosaur footprints, right? That's what the legs are on this thing. Mm-hmm. Well, again, it's going to destroy the site. They can't use it. So I'm pretty sure that as soon as we raised the alarm, that the BLM rushed out and ripped out the boardwalk before they could be told not to do anything. And I think that's where I think that's kind of sort of what happened. We'll find out, but I'm guessing something somewhat similar to that happened. But what was really fascinating though is our governor was in Washington, D.C., and for a completely unrelated matter, was having dinner with the undersecretary of the Department of the Interior.
Okay.
And so Spencer Cox
Hmm.
texted me and said, "Hey, I'm having dinner with the Undersecretary of the Department of the Interior, and this is the number one issue I'm going to discuss." And so when that happened, that's when they said, "Okay, we're going to shut down the work site, not do anything, send the paleontologist in." And it was funny. The paleontologist came down and he said, "Yeah, you've destroyed tracks." And his report is going to come out. He did meet privately with the BLM, but there is no question that they seriously destroyed tracks. And the thing is, the final assessment we're not going to be able to do. And you know this with your background. If they're going to go in and replace the boardwalk, we don't want to uncover all those tracks. It'd be the
Yeah, for sure.
put it, yeah, put in the new boardwalk, and then let's do an assessment of how bad the damage is. I can tell you this much: where that bulldozer is parked in the pictures on Twitter is on top of a crocodilian lay site. So
Oh.
we know that that's likely destroyed.
Hmm.
But you know, the ancient birds. I mean, birds came into the earth what 150 million years ago, something like that.
Yeah, around that, maybe a little bit before. Depends on exactly where you draw the line for bird versus not bird, but give or take around there. Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing is, so these tracks are 116.3 million years ago, and the reason why they know that is the ash layer that was on top of it. They can date it,
Hmm.
but so these are, you know, somewhat, you know, some of the first tracks that there are. What's really fascinating is these tracks are as close to us as they are the Tyrannosaurus Rex, right?
Hmm.
Like people don't realize just these tracks would have been about as old to Tyrannosaurus as they are to us today. Um, but so anyway, we'll have to see how bad those are damaged. But the good news is that the BLM has committed to rehiring and actually having a paleontologist on staff. I think that was the first big, huge, glaring mistake. Is ever since their paleontologist left and she went to go take over a Dinosaur National Monument,
Hmm.
um, they didn't rehire a paleontologist. And not having a paleontologist at the field office in Moab is kind of like not having an emergency room doctor in an ER, right? Like,
Right. And when I read that, I almost fell out of my chair because like I personally know, you know, a dozen people who would kill for that job.
well, not only that, I mean, can you imagine being the BLM, you know, in the BLM field office and the paleontologist in Moab? There aren't many places on Earth that are better than
Yeah.
that, right?
Right. And it's like there's so much material around, and that is, you know, especially like as a vertebrate paleontologist, that is one of the best positions you could possibly want. You know, there's so much excellent material to work with, and there's also, uh, you know, it's just a fantastic area in general. You know, paleontology notwithstanding, and so I tried to find any one of their statements that sort of said anything about why they hadn't filled it because I believe so the person who left was her name is Rebecca Hunt Foster, and I believe she left in 2018.
I think it was something like that.
Okay.
So her husband's also a really phenomenally well known paleontologist. I mean,
Hmm.
they're such a cool dynamic duo, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so when she left, they never rehired. Well, and by the way, part of the thing that I would see, again, I'm an investment banker, right?
Hmm.
I have undergraduate degrees and I studied, you know, a lot of science, but I am not a paleontologist. However, if I was a paleontologist, your colleagues that would come through there would be, I mean, you've got like Martin Lockley, right? Who
Hmm.
is, you know, his dad's my hero. You know, his dad's a really, really famous naturalist.
Hmm.
But Martin brought David Attenborough to this track site. And so there's just some really neat people that come and do research there from all over the world. And, you know, this track site, what's really fascinating about it too is the South Korean government paid for a lot of the development of the site. So did a lot of people from Poland.
Hmm.
This was an internationally funded excavation, and so it's got global significance. I mean, people from all over the world recognize how unique this track site is,
Yeah.
and um, The only people who didn't recognize how special it was the BLM in Moab. They're the ones, they're the only ones who didn't sit back and think, we're about to go work on the most important track site in the Moab area. Maybe we should have a paleontologist around. And they didn't. And see, there's other things that environmental impact study said they were supposed to do. And you know this from your background. One of the things you do is you have the paleontologist go in and flag where you can't drive, where it's unsafe to go.
Right.
They didn't do that. There was no supervision. There was nobody there. And so they violated their own environmental impact study. And so now they're going to go back and redo it. But it's just a heartbreaking thing. The good news is we stopped it before it got worse. Had they actually succeeded in putting in that boardwalk, those tracks would have been gone forever.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. Is, you know, especially sort of looking forward as to, you know, how did this happen? I think that's really the most important thing, and I'm sure we'll do a follow-up piece at some point when the final report about it gets, you know, ideally released to the public. I'm not sure exactly, you know, what their plans are for that. If they're just going to keep it internal, I kind of doubt it with how much publicity this.
Oh no, I think
but
here's the thing: is it will definitely be made available.
Yeah. But yeah, so I'm sure when that happens, we'll do some kind of follow-up about it, and it'll be really interesting to see, you know, how much new information comes out, because I'm sure that there will be. You know, a lot of the folks at the field office there have been a little hesitant to say too much, understandably. You know, if they're under investigation, you know, I wouldn't want to be telling everything to papers either. But looking at how this happened, you know, it's unfortunate that it had to be such a significant site, but, you know, hopefully this really reinforces a lot of the protocols that are in place and make sure that they're actually followed. Because
see, that's, you know, you're completely right. But see, this is the problem: is there are federal laws in place and there are policies in place that are supposed to make sure that this never happens. The problem is that people disregarded them who are entrusted with this. And I'll tell you right now, see, for me, you know, I live in Utah. This is home to me. And, you know, and it's a real strange thing. You know, our state had such a black eye in the media about Bears Ears and about Grand Staircase. And it was there was a lot of cynical stuff. But here's the problem. I grew up going to Bears Ears. I've been going there since I was a fetus for the most part, you know. And when President Obama, and again, whether you like the policy or not is irrelevant. This isn't a political thing, but when he you know, designated as a national monument, again, remember that's the size of basically Delaware.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a giant monument that had no public restrooms, had no funding, had no increased employees. They had no designated campsites. They had no restrooms. Again, they had no places for garbage and stuff. And the looting that happened, where people came in, and there were places that I knew that had old pottery, that had old, you know, a lot of neat things there, and people have just taken it home. And so they invited the world to come in and go look at that site. Well, there's also paleontological stuff that's there.
Yeah.
And, you know, so part of the problem here is a lot of the people who you know, politically who've been involved in Utah, a lot of people think that they don't care about conservation. Well, the difficulty is they care about conservation, but at some point we have to have a conversation about the type of stewards the federal government is to the lands in Utah. They've got just this huge, I mean, tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars of care that's supposed to be done to these national monuments, national parks, national forests, that hasn't been done. And so there's all of this, you know, work to actually preserve these treasures, and the federal government hasn't been taking care of them. And then you hear about this, and it's kind of hard not to get a little bit cynical, because I pride, you know, living in Utah with our state with the state parks does such, and our Department of Natural Resources, they do such a great job of conservation. And if you look at our reclamation of old mining sites and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
They do such an amazing job of protecting this. And we've got a very qualified state paleontologist in Jim Kirkland.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got this record of the people in Utah taking really good care of our land. The difficulty is that because Utah is, I think it's the second or third most federally owned state in the nation, so much of our land is tied up in inventory by the federal government.
Yeah.
That's a lot of trust for us to put in the federal government. And when they do stuff like this, hopefully people start realizing maybe it's okay for us to want a little bit more oversight and want to have a little bit more answers to questions about why we're not taking better care of this land.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that's something that, and not to make this, a super coastal elite sort of things, but so I'm from the East Coast originally. I live in California now. I lived in South Dakota for a couple of years. But, on the East Coast, there's no federal land, really. And so this is just something that is not at all on most people's radar. The way it is in a place like Utah or a place like Nevada, where well over half the state is federally owned.
Yes, 2/3 of my state is federally
Yeah.
owned. And see, and this is the thing that matters to me, and why I have 4 sons, and I want them to care about things like global warming.
Mm-hmm.
I want them to care about things like endangered species. I want them to care about pollution. And what's really interesting is I have found that if I can get my kids to care about an animal that's been extinct for over 100 million years, that getting to care about species that are still alive is very easy.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, for paleontology, I've encouraged it for my kids because I always tell people it's a gateway science, right?
Yeah, it absolutely is.
Well, and the thing is, like, and you know this from your career, if you want to get into paleontology, well, writing and reading are very important, and rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
Math is certainly an issue. You've got geology, you've got chemistry, you've got biology. I mean, there's a lot of transdisciplinary sciences and places to study.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I've really encouraged my kids with it, and it's worked out phenomenally for me. And the reason why I bring that up is this track site. People from all over the world come to Utah to see stuff like this.
Right.
And there are parents who are taking their kids, just like I take mine, to go see these tracks. And I remember when my dad took me to these tracks, and by the way, keep in mind, they were uncovered not that long ago. But my father, I was an adult when my dad took me to see these tracks. It was probably about 10 years ago, maybe not quite 10 years ago. But my dad took me out there because we still go do that stuff. My dad still wants to take his boy out to go look at track sites. And I take my kid out to go look at track sites. But the necessity for us to have good stewards of this land to make sure that that stuff's preserved for the future generations, I think is such just an absolutely incredible thing. And the good news, I think, is that we have enough people who are angry enough about this that they're not going to let this go without having serious answers, so that we simply don't repeat it.
Yeah. And, just based on everything that I've seen sort of online, because I kind of about once a week, look up just like the hashtag Mill Canyon Tracksite on Twitter just to see, because obviously things have quieted down quite a bit since the initial, week or two after, after everything kind of happened. And people are still kind of talking about it. Obviously it's a lot less, but people are still talking about it and, wanting questions answered, which, if this had happened on, some track site in the middle of absolute nowhere, Nevada, or somewhere else in Utah that's not, as noticeable, it might not have been, noticed and picked up and spread so widely on the internet. So it's, like I said, it's really tragic that it had to happen to such a significant site. But I really do hope that some kind of good can come out of it.
And I think it will. I think there are a couple of lessons kind of for the public to learn about this. And the first one is this: is I think if you get on social media or you listen to a lot of the news, we're kind of being, I guess, I guess it's kind of a condition, I guess would be the right word, to think that there's a lot more animosity in politics than there probably
Yeah.
really.
Hmm.
And it's interesting is that Andrew Stoddard, who's a state legislator, who's a Democrat, he issued a statement on this. And I talked to the minority leader in the House, Brian King, who's a very good friend of mine, a very good man. I spoke with leadership in the Republican side in our state, and they were very concerned about this. I spoke to Democrats and Republicans, and not a single person was brushing this aside. They all understood the necessity to talk about this. And I think one of the first lessons is this: is that if we fall into the trap that, oh, our elected officials don't care, and
Hmm.
therefore we're not going to reach out to them, if we hadn't reached out to our elected officials, that track site's destroyed. And so I think one of the things is this: is if you are at all care about this stuff, it's always been my experience that elected officials are way more approachable than we give them credit for. They're way more reasonable than we give them credit for. And this is bipartisan. I'm not talking about
Hmm.
one tribe over another, because I don't care about donkeys and elephants.
Right.
I think that most elected officials are way more reasonable than we give them credit for. And I think that people should feel empowered that when they find stuff like this, to raise their voice. And their elected officials, they actually, again, my experience has been most of them actually care. And it's too simple and too easy for us to become cynical and just think, no, they don't care. No, they do. And I've been working on legislation nationally since I was 22 years old.
Hmm.
And um, and I can tell you that in multiple states where I've worked with legislators, I've always found that they're very responsive. They care about these issues, and not only that, they act. I've never had where I've brought an issue to any legislator or elected official, and they've just kind of ignored it. It has always been my experience that they care. It was really funny. Even like, we had the Attorney General for the state of Utah, Melissa Holyoke, who's our Solicitor General. She was like just waiting to get the green light to actually go to court and federal court and actually and stop the BLM from
Hmm.
moving forward. I mean, we had people lined up to act that we haven't been able to sing their praises yet. But again, it took one person, which happened to be me, but I was really just being a voice for my son.
Hmm.
But one person speaking up, and then more and more, and we amplified that voice. And then Smithsonian Magazine's carrying it, Gizmodo's carrying it. You've got all the local newspaper, and this is another hurrah for local journalism. But we got all of these people to tell this story, and so much pressure got put on the BLM that they backed down. And had it's really just such a wonderful, good lesson for the public that you kind of don't realize just how much of an influence for good you can be if you'll just speak up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that's something that, no matter how plugged into politics, you know, you think you are, there's always more you could probably do and know on the local level, which is something that is so overlooked by so many people today. I don't want to turn this into like an entirely political, conversation, but I guess sort of wrapping up a little bit here, you, like you said earlier, you're not a paleontologist. You're just kind of an everyday person. Admittedly, a pretty well connected one. Not too many regular people have their state's governor, have their phone number. But other than just sort of being aware of your local representatives, what can regular everyday people do to get their elected officials, at least get this on their radar?
Well, I can tell you this. I will tell you my advice is really quite simple. First one is, um, be reasonable and rational
Hmm.
and be level headed. You don't need to engage in histrionics. You don't need to bully and belittle. You don't need to insult and attack. That never works. I think if you were to simply just voice a concern with most legislators, um, that in and of itself is going to carry a lot of weight. And I think that's one of the most important things. The second thing is that you want to make sure that you know who to reach out to. An example, yeah, I mean, not everybody's going to know how to pick up the phone and they've got a senator who they can call on the whim, right? But here's the thing is your city councilman, if you don't know your state representative, your city councilman does,
Hmm.
and they can help you reach out. And that city councilman and that state legislator can reach out to the congressman and the senator. And so the local government, the government closest to you, if you feel like a congressman is not going to take your phone call, they're going to for a state legislator, and they're going to for a mayor, and they're going to for a city council. And so that's a really important thing too. Is I think it's important to have really nice, functional relationships. One of the things I would also suggest is Ronald Reagan once talked about how that if we agree, I think the number he said was 80% of the time, you're my friend and my ally, not my 20% enemy, right?
Hmm.
And I'm kind of paraphrasing that, but it's okay to have disagreements with people, but you have to find your way of working with people who you might disagree with on some issues. And there are people I disagree with on issues, but I can find common ground where it matters. And I think that's another thing too, is too often people think, oh, well, I disagree with this person's stance on issue X. And so because of that, you think of them as your enemy and that they'd never help you and that they, are literally the enemy. I think that's not the right way to look at this. Instead, look and say, okay, look, can I get past the fact that they disagree with me on one issue, knowing that they'll help me and work with me on another?
Hmm.
And I think that if we kind of work to develop those kind of relationships is great. The other thing too is social media is really powerful. I mean, man,
Yeah.
it is really powerful. It I posted the pictures of the track site with the bulldozer tracks over on top of the dinosaur tracks, and that got amplified so quickly that all the media picked it up because they saw it was trending. um, having where you're active on social media. And the thing is, like with me, I mostly post pictures of fish and sharks and
Hmm.
kind of tell their story. That's mostly what my social media is. Um, but a lot of the people who care about this, they found it and they amplified it, and then the local media picked it up and they amplified it. So that's another really powerful tool and mechanism, is to kind of get people to work together on this. We had the Society of Vertebrate Paleontologists who issued their letter, which was phenomenal. I don't know if you got a chance to
Yeah.
read
Hmm.
that. And then they actually invited my son to be a member, which was really cool. So he's now a member,
Oh, that's
which is,
awesome.
yeah, it's just the coolest thing on earth. Um, and then you also had where other organizations, they actually issued cease and desist letters.
Hmm.
And so other people came and worked with this. And the thing is, my little boy was the one who sounded the alarm at the beginning, but so many just really good, sincere, genuine people got together, and it was this kind of collective effort. The elected officials, the public, the paleontologists, the NGOs. I mean, all these groups got together and said, "Hey, listen, we were worried about this." And I think ultimately the final lesson is this: people really like dinosaurs, man. I mean, they
They
really
sure do.
like dinosaurs. And so, if this had been an issue that wasn't dinosaurs, I don't know if people would have gotten this visceral about it, right? But man,
Yeah.
don't mess with fossils. It's,
Hmm.
people love dinosaurs. Makes me wish I would have been a paleontologist because, you know, going to the, bring your parent to school class, like, the career day,
Yeah.
you'd be the paleontologist. You might as well be Superman or Batman.
Well, and
Um,
it's so funny that you say that, because I've done some stuff with like elementary school classrooms, And I always have to preface it with, I'm really sorry, I don't study dinosaurs, because I mostly work with mammals,
Sure.
and it's like, you know, it's still really cool, you know,
Okay, yeah, but so you have the North
but
American cheetah. Like, so here's the difference. Okay, you go to school and say we had North American cheetahs, we had woolly
hmm,
rhinos, we had all these
yep.
neat animals. I go and I say I'm an investment banker. Well, what do you do? I work on the stock market. And the kids are like, okay, next, get this guy
hmm,
out of here, bring us somebody else. But um, nonetheless, and so I think that's another thing too is that people care. People care more than I think we give them credit for too. And for me, it was heartwarming because, again, I think it's so easy to become jaded and cynical about everything.
yeah,
And it's one of those times where people from every persuasion, everything. We had indigenous communities who were getting involved in this. I mean, it was such a wonderful thing. And it was, the thing is, and I don't mean to be hokey about this, but it felt like community, right? Like there's this community that came together and said, hey, we want to protect this.
hmm,
Great story. Just a
yeah,
really
absolutely.
heartwarming story.
Yeah. And that was something that I really got out of the Gizmodo article was, you know, it talked about how, you know, just regular, you know, folks that live in Moab sort of came out and were, you know, talking to various, you know, officials and just came out to show their support, you know, and everything for everything that was going on. And I was like, man, after the last couple of years that we've had, that is just really cool to see. Uh, so I think that is going to about wrap it up. I don't want to keep you too long, but I guess is there anything that you want to say to close out? Any like organizations you want to plug, or you know, your social media, your website, or anything?
No, no, no. I think one of the things that I think is also neat too is that if you happen to ever be where you visit the Utah area
Hmm.
and you're ever out here, we have a really great Friends of Paleontology out here that if you get involved with, they're invited to go all the time out to sites. And it's one of the neat things is that if you are somebody who, you've got a kid or you've got a loved one or you've got friends or just you want to go out there,
Hmm.
um, our scientists in Utah, whether it's you or other people who get permits to come out and work in Utah, if you get involved through the Friends of Paleontology, which is a neat volunteer organization, all the time you get invited to go out and dig sites. I've taken my kids on dig sites, and I mean, and it's just fascinating. And you know this again, but I mean, there are ancient dinosaurs in Utah. I mean, but there are also sharks. You
Hmm.
could do an entire episode of Shark Week for Utah. But if you ever want to go out and actually see what a dig site's really like, the Friends of Paleontology in Utah is such a great organization, and you might want to give a look at it because there's some opportunities and some experiences that are just absolutely fascinating. I mean, not many people get to say, like I was on a dig site looking for fossils. Wait, you did what? It's one of those. It's one of those
Yeah,
cool things. But if you're a citizen scientist and you want to get involved, there are plenty of opportunities.
awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and, you know, sharing your experience and you know, just a little bit of advice for anybody who wants to become a little bit more involved in this kind of thing, especially regarding government, you know, because conservation is super, super important. And like you said, sort of at the beginning, you know, there are some people who sort of who might disagree that, you know, how much different levels of government should be involved in it. But I feel like there are very few people who can say that they do not care whatsoever about conservation. So I think that's a really good message to send us off on. So uh, thank you very much for your time. And we will cut to an outro here.
Absolutely. Talk to you soon. Thank you much.
And we're back, and yeah, that was a conversation that needed to happen. Thank you to Jeremy Roberts for joining us in the podcast, and thank you, Gavin, for putting all this together. I think this is one that a lot of people need to hear if they have any interest in this space at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said at the beginning, this is something that I personally like outside of me just being a paleontologist. This is something that just on a broader level is really important. In a way that, you know, Mr. Roberts really articulated really well toward the end of the conversation, where it's like, yeah, the government does stuff wrong. It just does. It's run by people. People do stuff wrong. But holding them accountable is really, really important, and making sure things like this don't continue to happen is also really important. Um, so I really want to thank Mr. Roberts for taking the time, especially because we had some technical difficulties uh, getting the actual interview happening. So I really want to thank him, and also his son, for being the one to bring this to his attention that this was a big problem. Um, and next week we actually have another, maybe not interview, I wouldn't call it, but
Conversation.
another guest in the podcast that is going to be a very different mood than this one's going to be.
But you'll have to wait for next week to get to that one.
Absolutely. So all of Mr. Roberts' links will be down in the description, even though he was fairly humble about it, as well as the Utah Friends of Paleontology. Their website will be down below as well. But yeah, again, thank you so much to Mr. Roberts for making this happen.
This has been episode 64 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. Thank you very much to Jeremy Roberts for joining us on this episode. We will see you all next week with episode 65. Have a great day and take care, everybody.